Great. Welcome everyone to panel number 6, Understanding BPD as a Disability at Work, School, or in Daily Living. We are delighted you could join us today. My name is Julia. I will be moderating the panel as a volunteer for Emotions Matter. While I'm doing the introductions, we invite you to write in the chat where you are joining us from today. Welcome. I live in Queens, New York. So Emotions Matter is a 501c3 nonprofit organization founded in 2015 to support, educate, and advocate for those impacted by borderline personality disorder. To learn more about us and our programs, go to the website www.emotionsmatterbpd.org or head to the expo. Emotions Matter's philosophy, we strive to create a safe, judgment-free space for people with borderline personality disorder. We accept that there is a spectrum of experiences within the BPD community. We honor where people are on the journey without judgment or assumptions. We encourage people to define their own path toward recovery. We speak as experts of our own lived experience, not as medical experts. Okay, and with that, I'm going to stop sharing here and introduce our panel. So today on our panel, we have Sandy Glover. Sandy has a master's degree in professional counseling. She is certified in WRAP, a certified peer specialist, and a trained peer facilitator. Currently, she is a NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness, in our own voice presenter, and has a published article through them, as well as running a mental health blog website. Hannah Fox. Hannah's been a peer facilitator with Emotions Matter for about 2 years. She's currently studying psychology in college with the goal of eventually becoming a clinical psychologist. Danzig, MD, is a fourth-year resident physician in the Department of General Psychiatry at Yale University School of Medicine and will soon be completing a fellowship in law and psychiatry at Yale. She trains other residents on forensic topics and is passionate about racial justice, prison reform, patients' rights, and informed consent. Kellyann Navarre, BA, is a Psychology and Disabilities Studies college graduate and clinical psychological science research assistant with lived experience of borderline personality disorder. She is an Emotions Matter BPD support group facilitator and member of the Education Committee. Andrea Rosenhaft is a licensed clinical social worker in the New York City area. She is the founder of the mental health advocacy and awareness organization, Be Well, Be Strong, which focuses its efforts on BPD, eating disorders, and major depressive disorder, all of which she has recovered from. And with that, I will ask the panelists to take it away.
Thank you, Julia. We're really excited to be here today. Before we get started, I am going to send a quick link in the chat for those of you who may benefit or need captions. Unfortunately, it does not appear there is captioning through this conference software. That's an accessibility problem, but Chrome does provide this option by itself for live automatic captions. And I'm assuming most, if not all, are actually using that browser because that's what's compatible with this conference. So I'm going to send that. It's like a quick 3 or 4 step process if anyone might find them beneficial or necessary. So with that said, thanks everyone for joining. I think this panel is significant because the conversation around BPD often does not include diverse experiences about how the different areas of functioning in BPD, including the emotionally, the interpersonally, behaviorally, cognitively, and identity, might impact someone on a more day-to-day basis, whether that be in work or in school or other contexts. Nor does the conversation typically include different ways of coping in these contexts or other accommodation options. So it tends to really exclude disability perspectives. So we will each be taking turns discussing and responding to some of these important points, answering your questions towards the end, and providing some suggestions. We would love to hear from you. So does anyone have any additional comments or questions you can think of that I might be forgetting before we dive right in? No? Okay, I see some heads nodding. I am really excited to get started on this topic, especially with such a great group of people. I think first it's really important to recognize that BPD has a lot of different symptoms that impact daily living contexts, also faces barriers, created barriers in society. For example, when it comes to accessibility, such as in treatments or accommodations or other social structures and stigmas. And by definition, both of these mean it's a disability, it's a psychological disability. And for me, this has been really important to understand because as a college student, BPD impacts my emotion dysregulation and stress tolerance in this context, which can lead to other problems. I think listing off things can be one thing, but understanding how different symptoms and experiences rise and fall with each other, or how one symptom might trigger another, is a different story. So for example, like in tests or quizzes, presentations could have resulted in like spiraling or extreme stress. And we know that stress with BPD triggers paranoid ideation and dissociation. So often I'd experience like a dramatic increase of symptoms and distractibility. And other stresses were like with the workload or with relationships with teachers and kind of fearing that rejection and criticism and internalizing grades. So maybe some of you can relate to this. It's kind of like experiencing my usual symptoms of BPD in school settings, which impacts me there and sometimes has additional stress. So I'd love to hear from other experiences on the panel about how BPD might impact you in different contexts as well.
So for me personally, one of my biggest struggles in terms of work, school, just all areas of daily living has been mostly with like attendance and turning in assignments on time, especially on higher symptom days, due to some big overwhelming emotions that we all kind of feel with BPD. I've often had a hard time getting out of bed, as well as communicating effectively with others. Especially in terms of letting professors know when I'm struggling and when I need some accommodations and extra time to complete assignments.
So with me in the work setting, one of the criteria for BPD is big fear of rejection. And since BPD is rarely diagnosed in isolation, with the anorexia, one of the hallmarks of anorexia is perfectionism. So with my supervisors, I had this big fear of rejection. And what I wanted from them was immediate feedback and immediate praise. And when I didn't get it, I'd get really angry. I couldn't go to them and say, I'm really angry. I would self-destruct. And I would go home and you know, I would restrict or I would self-harm. And, you know, in therapy, one of my goals was to obviously stop that behavior before it escalated. So it took a long time, but I was able to recognize the pattern in myself eventually and be able to de-escalate.
For myself, I had worked for 20 years before I ended up going on SSDI. And the biggest problem was my perfectionism, like Andrea had said, and I had such a fear of rejection. I was so afraid of that imposter syndrome. When I worked as a clinician, even doing assessments that should have taken an hour and a half would take me 3 hours because I was so afraid if I made one error that I was a failure. And for every time I would work a new job, start a new job, it would start all over and I would spiral. So I'd end up going from one job to the next until where eventually it got to the point where I wasn't able to work and did go on SSDI.
Yeah, and I think even more so, like studies show people with BPD are more likely to have cross-disability experiences. And that means we are more likely to have other disabilities with it. So we might experience learning disabilities, chronic pain, chronic illnesses such as fibromyalgia, EDS, POTS. They're all, studies show this is all really common with BPD. Before we move forward, I think it's important to discuss that because sometimes they can impact each other. So for example, stress triggers POTS for me. I have a chronic illness called POTS. And so managing BPD is a really important part of, I think, prioritizing and targeting the improvement in these contexts. So I think identifying these different areas we like maybe struggle with, which is like one of the first steps, right? Has been an important part for me when it comes to learning different coping skills. And if anyone has any to share in the chat that they like, different coping skills, that would be awesome to hear from you. But I'm actually going to share one. It's called, let me just get the link to share. It's called Accepts, and it's from DBT, and it's one of my favorite coping skills to use in high stress situations or in which is often in school, but not always for me. So this is like, Accepts is a skill in DBT, and it uses acronyms, which makes it easier to implement in real time. That's one thing I really like about DBT. And it's specifically for the stress tolerance, like I mentioned, which is for high stress situations. So for example, the E when it comes to accepts stands for like emotions. And that specifically talks about like inducing an opposite emotion. So maybe I'm feeling like a failure, or maybe I'm really stressed, or I'm having self-injury urges, and I need to deliberately induce an opposite emotion. Maybe that's doing something nice for myself, like getting myself my favorite meal, doing my nails. I don't know, just random examples here. Whatever it is, I need to pull away, or maybe it's watching a comedy. So I really like this skill, opposite emotion, opposite action, which is like basically recognizing what you're feeling and what can I do to help create a countering emotion. And the S in accepts, I'm just skipping to like my two favorite ones, stands for sensory experiences. And that might be helpful to help ground myself to the present moment. I really like candles. I actually have one right now kind of sitting next to me. I also really like petting my dog. So all of these are different sensory experiences. And like, especially in high stress situations in school, like basically rather than acting on a potentially harmful feeling, this has been helpful for me to reframe it and see it as, what exactly are my emotions trying to communicate to me day to day? And what can I do to myself to help myself function in these contexts? Like they say, they do serve a purpose, right? So maybe if I'm stressed, it's because I need to take a step back and use one of these skills, rest or eat or whatever it is.
For me personally, when I get really stressed and overwhelmed, I tend to procrastinate, especially in terms of like assignments. So something that I found very helpful is just pacing myself and not leaving things until the last minute, which is obviously easier said than done. Something that I like to do is taking breaks to reward myself if I'm working on like a long assignment or I have a lot of assignments to do. That could look like watching a YouTube video that makes me laugh in between reading chapters in a textbook, taking a walk, any form of self-care that I feel like engaging in, such as playing with my dog. Something else that has really helped me is being able to advocate for my needs. That is definitely a skill in itself. But things that have helped me do that is interpersonal skills, such as the DBT skill Dear Man, which stands for describe, express, assert, reinforce, being mindful, appearing confident, and negotiating. I like to follow Dear Man scripts when I'm really struggling to assert myself and ask for what I need.
So one of my favorite skills and one I use all the time is radical acceptance. It sounds so simple, but it's so hard. I was really stressed out at my job in 2018 to the point I had a stroke. And there was some cognitive deficits that were permanent, and I've worked really hard to overcome them. But I had to radically accept that my brain was changed and there were certain things that I couldn't do or that I had more difficulty doing.
I'm on, thank you.
Hi, welcome. And, you know, since my intellect is really my, you know, ticket to everything I do, I'm a social worker, I use my brain, I write, I use my brain. It was really difficult for me to accept that things had changed in that regard. So I used radical acceptance every day, it seemed like every minute, every day, to try and come to terms with that. And I use radical acceptance in other areas of my life too, but that was the big one. So yeah, it's like I said, it sounds so simple, but it's so difficult.
I think Andrea and I wrote these things together because I was going to say my first radical acceptance, especially that I'm not able to work any longer. Just getting up every single day is a struggle for me. And I have to accept the fact that in a sense, I feel this way every single day, but it's what can I do with it? I feel every single day like I failed because I'm not able to work, but it's what can I do with it? I know I feel this way every single day, therefore I accept the feeling in the moment, and I allow myself to move on by utilizing skills that I know that are helpful for me. So most important for me is a daily routine that keeps my anxiety and my depression in check, taking a walk, exercising in some fashion. Eating healthy is very huge for me because I did live on sweets, and that was just feed into the depression. It was the cycle of guilt. You know, like Kellyann had said, even something as simple as watching maybe something on Netflix, a comedy that just gets me out of that element of not feeling so good about myself. So again, yes, I have definitely learned that radical acceptance has been absolutely huge for me.
Actually, something you said, Sandy, reminded me of the please skill in DBT, like talking about how it's so important to take care of ourselves physically because there's different physical vulnerabilities to emotion dysregulation, right? So like if we're not sleeping well, if we're not eating well, or if we're not physically feeling well, all of this makes us more vulnerable to negative emotions. Did Ayala have, did you have any comments before we move on? Or?
Yes, I'm so sorry, everybody, for my technical problems, but I'm glad I'm on with you. I missed a little, but I'm really happy to be here and happy to hear about radical acceptance. I think from a clinician's point of view, I think one of the things that's so important for us to be able to do with the people we work with is to really provide a lot of education and understanding about the daily experience, just like Sandy was describing, how hard it is every day. I think, you know, BPD is an illness that affects people every single day. It's not episodic like some of the other, you know, illnesses we might see that are physical or psychiatric. And for that reason, I think we really have to, it's in our role as clinicians, it's really important to provide validation. And to provide validation through education, and whether that's through bringing in neuroscience or bringing in big studies about things, or just about really like listening to and validating the experience that people are coming in with, so that radical acceptance can be a step that gets taken. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I hopefully some of these coping skills we're bringing up can be really helpful to everyone. Feel free to ask questions in the Q&A section towards the end. But I was also thinking about how, although it's important to understand when discussing coping with BPD from like a disability justice perspective, to think about not only like the internal ways of coping, but also sort of the external, like I mentioned about some of this created barriers, how they might connect. So externally, this includes like social adjustments, such as accommodations and accessibility. And without proper adjustments or disability supports, maybe it could impede progress or trigger symptoms. And this is actually sometimes used in some treatments to help people problem solve with their current social lives and what they can do to maybe improve their environment. And I don't think a lot of people may recognize that you can receive disability accommodations for BPD in school and in work and so on because of the way it impacts us day to day. It made college possible for me. It created opportunities, and it's not a failure. It's actually quite common, and it's a disability right. And if anything, for me, it was very humbling and empowering to look at myself and say, I need these types of supports, and that's okay. And I actually personally received disability accommodations throughout college. For me, this was, just to name two for time's sake, it was extended testing time and flexible deadlines, because like we all know, BPD can lead to potential difficulties with memory, difficulties with moods, and sleep problems, which can also really impact the speed at which we work. And distractibility, or potentially hallucinations and dissociation under stress, is a big thing. So like I'd be going in trying to like navigate school or tests like in these very stressful contexts, or maybe I'm dealing with like a particularly symptomatic week and I'm right in the middle of school. So let me know if anyone has a more specific question about the disability accommodation process in school in the Q&A. I would be happy to talk about that. But I did find this a really important part of my college experience, and it actually helped make it enjoyable for me and provide like a really big sense of fulfillment, and it made college accessible to me.
For myself, I had worked for 20 years before I ended up going on SSDI, and that was very difficult in itself. But I actually didn't realize at the time that people with mental health issues could go on disability. And it was a friend that had mentioned it to me when I said I wasn't able to work. And she had said, why don't you try SSDI? And again, I thought it was for physical disabilities. The problem was I had applied, but I didn't realize I could actually get the help from my therapist filling it out, or Social Security. So it was a very overwhelming process. There was a lot of paperwork, and especially when you're depressed and don't have that energy, it was definitely very difficult. So again, had I had that help and known that I had the help, it would have made all the difference in the world. But at the same time, it has saved me. I'm able to survive, thank goodness, with it.
So I'm a college student, and specifically some accommodations that I have gotten through my school for school and classes that I found helpful have been extended deadlines, like Kellyann mentioned, the ability to have extra absences as needed, because a lot of classes and professors, after a certain amount, they'll start taking points off your grade. For exams, I've had extended time and the ability to take tests in a testing center, so it's a less distracting environment. I can use my laptop for note-taking because some professors have like a no laptop rule. I can have someone take notes for me. I can record my classes so I can refer back to them later on. I can choose to sit wherever I want in the classroom. It was really hard for me to get accommodations at first, because some clinicians that I've had in the past, therapists, psychiatrists, thought that I might take advantage of having the accommodations. So it was a little bit of a struggle to get there, but with some advocating, I was able to, thankfully. But it can definitely be frustrating when I feel like I know what I need and they're telling me, no, you'll abuse the privilege.
So in my first two jobs, I graduated with my master's in 2000, and in my first job, which went from 2000 to 2005, and my second job, which went from, I had a gap where I actually had a depressive episode and was out for a couple of years, and then my second job, which went from 2008 to 2015, both of them I had severe episodes of kind of a combination of all my diagnoses, the BPD, the anorexia, and the depressive episode, and I was hospitalized. And when I came back from the hospitalization, I was treated really badly. And this is by mental health outpatient clinics. And both instances were similar. I was stripped of my clinical responsibilities and given more administrative tasks. And, no accommodations were given. And it was just you were hospitalized for a mental health, and it's like your clinical acumen was erased, and I ended up leaving both jobs because I was humiliated and ashamed. And in the work world, you learn to keep quiet and not to speak out. And my third job, that's what I did. I never said I need a mental health day. I never disclosed. And it really took a toll because I sat in meetings and listened to people, listened to clinicians and professionals. Really, the stigma was apparent, and it really, really hurt me. And I felt ashamed of myself for not being able to speak up. And it really took its toll, and I just left that job as well. So, I just want to say that, we have a long way to go. We've come a long way, but we have a long way to go.
Yeah, I think to really go right off of that, I think it's impossible to talk about accommodation and disability with BPD without just naming the stigma and the invisibility and the misunderstanding of BPD, both in the world at large and also amongst psychiatrists and many other professionals who provide mental health care. And this really does a disservice because accommodations are necessary. I think if we keep the goal in mind, what's the goal? To have a life worth living, to have meaningful activities, to feel good. Sometimes that's not possible without disability or without accommodations. And I think this is a case, something I've had to do a lot of learning about myself. I think, when I entered the mental health workforce, there was this sort of instinctual rejection of the idea of disability for most kinds of psychiatric illness. And I think that has kept a lot of people from being able to succeed and thrive. And I mean that both in terms of the short-term disability and long-term disability. There are ways to live a meaningful life that don't involve having a job that makes money. There are ways to have a meaningful life that involve volunteering and educating in the community, maybe doing work that's less appreciated in our society, but very, very valuable. So not paid for, but still highly important. So that's from the long-term disability standpoint. From the shorter-term standpoint, if we want people to be able to engage in treatment, sometimes that's not compatible with work. And so if someone wants to engage in an intensive program or need a hospitalization, or even in their own treatment that might be incompatible with a rigid work schedule or school schedule, we need to be flexible in thinking. I think ultimately it comes down to working with the individual who's in front of you, regardless of the particular diagnosis, but to say, okay, here's this person's goals, and how do we help them achieve that? I've written many letters asking for accommodations for people in school. And the accommodations that Hannah had mentioned are really reasonable and can go a very long way. So I think from the clinical standpoint, we have to really work against this long-standing history of not seeing BPD as a disorder that warrants the kinds of accommodations that other illnesses do.
Yes, and it's really refreshing to hear a clinician talk about that, because that's one of the main reasons we're doing this panel, right? Is to really understand BPD as a disability in these contexts. And a lot of people don't recognize it. They might say like, oh, it's in your head, you're going to take advantage of it. And a lot of that is rooted in ableism and in stigma. And like I said, it's really important, I think, to see the different day-to-day symptoms, as well as the way that this can help us in treatment as well. If anything, when we have access to these meaningful activities, so like drawing this connection between the two, like whether this is school, work, or something else that you're really passionate about, research actually shows this can be an important part of managing your symptoms to thrive in life or as part of your recovery process. For me, it provides that sense of purpose, that sense of community integration, and accommodations allow this to happen. I also liked how you brought up like a flexibility. So there's another disability accommodation I receive where, for example, I get priority registration because when it comes to different treatment regimens and different schedules, certain people might have a more rigid schedule. So they need to have first pick for certain classes on certain days to be able to have access to that. Maybe it's an online course, so it's more flexible, or maybe it's just on certain days. And so that's another, I think, really important point, is just having this flexibility, because accommodations can really allow this to happen. And it's important to show both sides of the coin. So I think when considering the way BPD impacts people day to day, it's also important, I guess, to show, like, when it comes to treatment targets, we need to consider both skills and social accommodations in the process. And DBT actually does emphasize some of these social activities and accommodations, and so do other types of BPD treatment. So getting rid of this stigma and this ableist idea, like, that we should not be receiving these types of supports is crucial when it comes to improving the way that different procedures are run and the way that things are taught in textbooks or in clinical settings. And like, really, the structure of college has given me something to look forward to, as well as a form of like a sense of stability, passion, connection with people with similar interests. I am going into clinical psych, so it like provides that sense of like providing meaning and contribution to something bigger. And like, does anyone else maybe like feel the same way or have a similar experience with how they might connect?
So for me, it's interesting. First, when I was really struggling, school, work, anything that required any sort of responsibility was just not compatible with my BPD at that point. And it was really a struggle because I had these goals that I wanted to achieve, but I just felt like I wasn't able to, and I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to. But then once I started learning new coping skills and kind of reined my BPD in a little bit more, I was able to actually be helped with my BPD through school, work, other activities. It's like going to school, working, it's helped me set goals for my future and has given me motivation to achieve those goals. And then things like volunteering with Emotions Matter have given me enjoyment in life. Accumulating positive experiences and successes in these things have given me confidence to branch out even further, especially in forming and maintaining healthier relationships.
So what keeps me going is writing. I took a writing class when I was having that depressive episode that kept me out of work for a couple of years. I took a writing class, and my first submission was published, which I was like, wow, this is easy. And then started all the rejections. And, you know, I was transitioning once I was in the hospital, and one of the staff members told me I was a professional patient. And I never forgot that. And that really stung. And when I saw my name in print, I didn't realize it, but that was something that was like a high, like when I used to, you know, engage in other behaviors. And what I didn't realize it at the time, but that was a sustainable high. And so I just kept writing and taking classes and writing. And now I have a blog, and I write, and it helps me sort out everything positive. And whenever I need to think about something, I just write about it. And what I found that it helps other people when I write about my mental illness and recovery. It helps other people feel not so alone in their journey from the comments I get. And I just, you know, I write. I wake up early and I write late into the night, and I'll never stop writing.
Well, I really miss working as a therapist more than anything. Mental health had been my dream since I was a little kid. And though I'm not able to work, I have had to work hard to find meaning elsewhere, and not let that be my entire identity, because there's a person outside of my role as a therapist or in a career. So I found purpose and meaning through volunteering, and that was with Emotions Matter and also presenting in inpatient facilities through NAMI. Because when I was an inpatient, I would have loved to have had somebody there saying, "Hey, guess what? I've been there, and there is hope." So doing those things have given me such great purpose, because it's so rewarding to know that it's making a difference with somebody else and helping humanize them. Blogging also is huge for me, the mental health advocacy through blogging. It took a lot for me to be able to open up, like almost 40 years, to even say I live with any form, even if it was sadness. And that was the hardest thing for me to do. But once I opened that door, many people started coming forward saying, I live with it, or I have a brother who lives with it, and he was jailed, when he technically should have gone into inpatient. And that is just, again, that's just given me such great meaning and purpose.
I'm struck by some of the kind of the stigma that we're hearing about this idea of a professional patient. Makes me reflect on the fact that one of the things that I think makes BPD so invisible is that the external functioning of a person and their internal state can be so different. And how many people are walking around trying really hard to look okay and do what they feel they need to do to put on that good face, but inside are really suffering. And what a disservice we do by rejecting the possibility that someone needs help just because they might look better or they don't look the way we imagine someone suffering looks. And I think, we think about I know in some of the earlier conferences or some of the other panels, people have talked about the recovery that happens in BPD and how optimistic we can be, that most people with BPD get better. I also think when we think about trajectories, we need to think about it's not the same in every moment in time. So what might be needed, what the kind of support and accommodation that might be needed early on is very different than what might be needed later. Because what we're hearing is that folks with BPD do well having structure. They do well having meaningful activities. But at the start of it, the symptoms themselves can get in the way of being able to participate. And so often what we need to do is to provide a lot of support up front. And often that means having people take time away from school or from work so that they can engage in intensive treatment, to be able to develop the skills to thrive in those more structured environments, or to thrive in the kind of work, volunteer work or paid work that they might want to do. And so I think this really speaks to the fact that we need to be mindful of, and I'm saying this to myself as much as I'm saying this to other clinicians, to be mindful of the fact that how a person looks and presents themselves can tell us very little about the whole picture. And we can't allow that to deceive us into thinking, no, they're fine. They don't need anything. They're fine. They're going to do fine. Because what we're hearing is people they can do fine. If provided with the appropriate treatment and accommodations and support that's needed. And that varies along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to also understand that some people might utilize accommodations for the long term, and that's okay. I would very much discourage like a clinician kind of, oh, well, it's been a few years now, maybe you can decrease some of your accommodations. Like if they're telling you they need them, they need them. And I think that's a disability rights issue. And
sorry, can I just jump in and say one thing in relation to that? I think one thing is we need to trust our patients.
Yes.
And that's something that I meant to say earlier, but absolutely, we need to trust our patients. They know what's going on internally more than we do.
For sure. Yeah, and I think I really like kind of like how these points are being brought up, like the connections between the coping skills and the accommodation process. Like they're not necessarily separate. Sometimes you need coping skills to be able to make that jump into a school or work setting, or you need the skills and then you're into a structured setting and community integration or a meaningful activity, whatever that means to you, and then that can continue to foster your treatment. So the process I think is not necessarily separated. And I really like how people are showing how this is like connecting. So does anyone have any, I guess, final suggestions or comments in relation to the topic before we move on to, I guess, a Q&A? I guess my final suggestion would be to anyone who's here would be to definitely be patient with yourself and flexible with yourself in day-to-day context, in work and school or other meaningful activities. Because I know we live in like this culture, I think, where people act like we have to constantly like be producing things. We have to constantly, in order to like prove our worth to people, we need to do things by a certain timeline. We need to do things like graduate in 4 years, or we need to get a job and be able to produce as much as possible. And I would say, like, first of all, your worth is outside of that. You have internal worth. You as a person have inherent worth. Like, you don't need to be able to produce something to have value to society. Like, it's like a really Americanized way of thinking. Like, you need to be able to make money and produce work in order to have value. But that's not true. And I think it's way more important that you do things in according to your pace and in your life. Some statistics actually show that like less than half of college students graduate in 4 years. And not just people, but like that's people overall, not just BPD. And I would really encourage that people think about that and like when thinking about life, whether it be, I guess, school or work, that you definitely please remind yourself that it's okay to go at your own pace. I personally actually started off taking college one class at a time at a community college. And I think this really relates to how we're talking about like gradually working our way into it, gradually transitioning. I started off with one class at a time, learned some skills at a community, and I went to a community college. And that was one of the best decisions I ever made, because that's what helped me transition. And that's what helped me form that foundation and gradually build up the skills I need. If anything, I guess recognizing that you need to alter your course load or receive accommodations or whatever it might be for you takes strength and skill, because that means you have that self-awareness, and that's not a bad thing.
So I'm going to quote Marsha Linehan and say that we're doing the best we can at any time. I was diagnosed with BPD really long time ago in 1990, when the prognosis was really poor and no one knew anything, and there was no internet, actually, if you can believe that. So we were being told that our behaviors were manipulative and attention-seeking. So when in truth we were just suffering, and we weren't given the tools as children even to know how to cope with our feelings. And I did DBT, but I also had the opportunity to be in another intensive treatment called transference-focused psychotherapy, where I was able to go back into my childhood and look at how I wasn't given the tools to cope, and how I was brought up. So I was able to, be more kind to myself, and realize that I wasn't manipulative and I wasn't attention seeking. So, I just want to say to everybody, especially all the clinicians out there who still carry that mindset of people with BPD, we are not, we're just suffering, and we're just not given the tools as children and young adults to communicate our pain. Thank you.
I absolutely agree with you, Andrea. When I worked as a clinician and a peer in the field of mental health, I had heard like pejorative terms, even unfortunately with clinicians stating, well, she's borderline and she's going to hate you 1 minute and love you the next. So just watch what you say. And that was really disheartening to hear. And that was actually before my diagnosis, because another point I want to bring up, I have been, I don't want to say misdiagnosed, but in a sense of, I also live with other diagnoses, but the borderline component was not, had taken an awful long time for clinicians to finally see that's what I was diagnosed with. And once I got that diagnosis, I was relieved, but to have heard some of these terms in the past, it was a little bit scary to hear. But at the same time, my misdiagnosis got me the help that I've needed. There were certain things that were missing, like the dialectical behavioral therapy. And I think it's really important to be cognizant of your symptoms because you do know yourself better than others. So if you have the opportunity, if you feel you've been misdiagnosed, I think it's really important, if you can, to have a second opinion. So I kind of combined that, but I just wanted to get that out in the clinical component. But as far as individuals and family members, first thing is, to me, knowledge is power, and education is the key. So when I got my diagnosis, finding out about it was really important. So reading books, or, I can say websites, but I also want to stress how important it is to make sure that they're credible. I usually like reading articles with somebody in the field, whether it's an MD or a PhD or licensed social worker. Support for everyone is essential. So for the individuals and the loved ones, is very important that you're able to also have that self-care and take care of yourself, because for family members, it's not easy. Also, it's not just us suffering, but they can be going through stuff with us too. And it's just really important that you don't run on empty. So whether it's, getting support through friends, family, other support groups, and then there's the self-care component, daily routine for individuals, hobbies for all of us, hobbies, your passion, whatever it may be. For me, it's exercise and my blogging, but whatever works for you. To me, it's self-care is essential for everyone. Support, and again, support for everyone included.
To people with BPD, I, above everything else, would just kind of say, I know it's hard and I know it's exhausting, but just try to keep advocating for accommodations, for your right to exist in a workplace or school or whatever activities you like to do, because accommodations are your right and you are entitled to them. And then to clinicians, family, friends, anyone without BPD, I would just say, just listen to us. Above everything else, just listen to us. And we ourselves better than anyone else.
It's hard to follow all of those points because they are better than anything I can say. I think yes to all of that, and I would say to clinicians, we have to check our bias, and we have to. I think there are two things that we have to do as clinicians, and this is for clinicians who appreciate the distress of BPD and for clinicians who appreciate how possible recovery is and who enjoy working with folks with BPD. We still have to check our biases because we're kind of swimming in a pool with a lot of misconceptions about BPD that can affect us. And so I think we need to constantly be pushing against that and noticing in ourselves when we're not hearing our patients. And I think one of the best ways to do that is to actually read and listen and learn from people with lived experience, which provides a kind of expertise that we don't get in our clinical training, whether that's in medical school or in graduate school, wherever that is, we don't get that expertise. And so recognizing that our patients are coming in with a whole set of expertise that we need to lean into and learn from. And also, for those of us who do love working with BPD and understanding BPD and appreciate it, it's on us to also educate our colleagues. There is so much misunderstanding out there. And the idea that people with BPD aren't likable, that's just simply not true. And that's not evidence-based. And when we're working in evidence-based spaces, we need to push against these ideas. And we need to push for evidence. I think one of the challenges with BPD is we have a lot of evidence-based treatment, which is great, but there are gaps in the evidence for lots of other things like accommodations. And that's an opportunity for us to think flexibly about what the individual person in front of us needs. And it's also an opportunity for us to engage in some advocacy. We push for more research on BPD and what people with BPD need. And that goes along with trying to tear down some of these really outdated and absolutely false ideas about what BPD is or what it's like to work with people with BPD. These ideas have not squared with my experience at all. So I think that's a message to clinicians. All of us need to check our biases and also work on sort of tearing down some of those stigmas that are out there that really exist in our clinical spaces.
That's like ending on a mic drop, right? That was awesome. Thank you so much. Did you have something to say, Andrea? I noticed you unmuted yourself.
I just wanted to add it, not just clinicians who are psychiatrists, clinicians who are PCPs and neurologists and orthopedists and every other field, because, when your chart goes to another doctor, you just get this look, just to give an example, I had a GI issue and I went to a GI and he's like, well, you might have to learn to live with this because it's all in your head. And by the time I got properly diagnosed with SIBO, a small interior bacterial overgrowth, I lost 20 pounds and was just so run down. It's just ridiculous. And just because I had a psychiatric diagnosis and I was on psych meds, I was automatically attributed to my complaint being all in my head. So,
Yeah, Andrea, I think I so appreciate that point, because I think I would love to think of the psychiatric space as being one that really understands BPD and is all ready to advocate and educate other medical specialties, but that's not where we're at, right? We have large numbers of psychiatrists who don't understand BPD. And so we need to we need to clean our own house, but we also need to be doing this other kind of advocacy. And that's true around, having a psychiatric illness in your chart, regardless of what it is, already provides a barrier to medical care. We know that. Having BPD in the chart, especially with how little other medical specialties know about BPD, is a whole barrier in and of itself. So you're just could not agree with you more. Sadly, we're still in a place where within the House of Psychiatry and even the House of Social Work and the House of Psychology, we still have so much work to do. And I think we need to do that all at the same time.
At the same time would be ideal, because if we wait, it's going to be the next century.
I like how we're talking about how just the different disciplines and different types of disabilities connect here. Like I had sort of mentioned, it's important to have like a holistic perspective because, like, for example, I've been discriminated against with chronic illness because they assume like I'm lying because of BPD, but at the same time, BPD symptoms such as stress also trigger some of my chronic illness symptoms. So it's like really, when it comes to having an intersectional approach, it's just so important to look at these different areas, how different types of disabilities, different professions, I think kind of, connect. So I actually, if anyone has any questions that they would like to respond to, I think now is a great time. I'm actually going to send some final resources in the chat before we wrap up, just so that like you're not scurrying around trying to like click on them last minute as it's ending. The first one is the BPD in Schools resource from Emotions Matter. This is a very thorough resource about the accommodation process and what it can be helpful for when you have BPD, whether it's in college or in high school before that. And so this is the BPD in Schools resource.
Very helpful for clinicians. I found it immensely helpful. I wish I had known about it way before I did.
I love it. I helped develop it, and having come from both the psychology and disability studies perspective, oh, yay, she has it. I love it. It's really helpful. And the second one is a peer resource list for people. It has a lot of different helpful ways of coping, podcasts, books, lots of things. So I did notice that I think there was a question that kind of asked a little bit about the accommodation process for schools. And just to briefly go into that, if anyone else would like to respond to this after I'm done, definitely please do so. So I'm going to try to make this short. But basically, I went to disability services, whether it's on their website or in person, and they have forms for you. It's usually a quick 2 to 3 page form, and it might ask about like what your diagnosis is, what are some functional impairments. That's sometimes how it's phrased on these forms. And what do you, like collaborating with your professional, you have to bring that to a professional and they fill it out with you and you collaborate on what you might find helpful, whether that's extended test time, whether that's flexibility with deadlines. The BPD in Schools resource provides a lot of different potentially helpful accommodations that you can look at. And from there, you typically fill out, like you register with disability services. Usually you have like a quick 1 hour or 2 hour intake session where you bring the form to them and they get you set up with their classes. It's really that simple, unless of course you face the barrier with mental health professionals, I guess, being resistant to filling out the form, which is what happened to me one time, like we were talking about with the stigma. So again, that's definitely problematic. I ended up actually just switching. I was like, yeah, I'm not, like, I see how you're clearly not willing to help me. And I went and I saw a different psychologist.
I want to add to that because I think it is a problem, and thinking from the clinical side, I can see that happening a lot. I would say, you know, certainly there are times when you need to switch to a different psychologist, psychiatrist, therapist, that if someone isn't understanding the basics of what you need, that is an important time to reconsider whether you're going to be able to get help. I think there's also, I would say bring some resources. You know, your psychologist, your psychiatrist, we might not be as educated about the ins and outs of these needs than we should be, or as we should be. And so I know I appreciate it when I have patients come to me and sort of bring me resources and information so that I can learn. I know that's a burden and that's unfortunate that hasn't been already, I'm not coming with that already. But a lot of us do want to learn and understand. I usually fill out disability or accommodations paperwork with patients together so we can go through and identify specifically what you need. And I would say in those situations, don't be shy. Let us know. We don't always know. And here's where our evidence base is lacking a little bit. So it is very individualized, and it's very much, you know, what we want to hear from you, what you need. And again, if you are encountering someone who just doesn't understand it or is completely resistant to the idea, that's unfortunate, but that's a reality. And I think it's important to validate that such mental health professionals do exist that don't understand BPD and that will not be willing to do this. And that's a time to think about how can I find someone who does understand and who can help.
I had seen this professional for over a year, very resistant to the idea, very, very not willing. So sometimes, and she kind of most of the time sat on her phone anyway during sessions, and lots of other problems. So basically, your face, Hannah, right? Yeah, so basically I knew at that time, like, this is the final straw. Sometimes you know when it's time to switch and find someone who's compassionate, validating, recognizes the importance of these supports. So does anyone else maybe want to answer any questions before we maybe close?
I can answer. There's a question regarding disability. I'm actually in the process of applying for disability right now. I'm actually in the appeal process for other health conditions. So basically the way that it started was I applied on the Social Security website, and they ask you a million questions, and I just filled it all in. And then they go and get information from all the doctors that I provided their names. And then the way it worked for me was then I got a denial months later. And then I wanted to get a lawyer for the appeal process. So the way that the lawyers typically work is most of the time when you get approved for disability, you'll get back pay from your date of disability. And most lawyers will take a percentage of your back pay as their payment. So you won't really ever need to physically like give them money that you had. It's just money from your back pay. It definitely is a stressful process, but it's doable, especially if you have supports, and it could definitely be easier if you start off with a lawyer in the first place.
All right, I think we are out of time for the panel today. So on behalf of Emotions Matter, I just want to thank all of the panelists for sharing and for this incredibly insightful discussion. Thank you to the attendees for the questions and comments. We're sorry we couldn't get to all of them today. But if you have an individual question that wasn't answered, you can connect with the presenters in the People Profiles Engage button on the left-hand side of the panel. There are also resources that we have, which are downloadable links related to the topic at the end of the screen. And as well, don't forget to check out the silent auction and text to give. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today.